It was supposed to be an uneventful stop at the diner off Route 49. The kind of place where travelers refueled on coffee and locals exchanged small-town gossip over stacks of pancakes. For James Carter, it was just a quick break during a long journey, a moment to stretch his legs, grab a bite, and let his companion, Max, rest beside him. James wasn't the type to draw attention. In his late 40s, he carried himself with a quiet confidence that came from years of discipline and experience. His outfit, just a plain hoodie and jeans, spoke to his humble nature. There was nothing flashy about him, nothing to make him stand out. If you passed him on the street, you might think he was just another ordinary man. And that's exactly how James liked it. Max, on the other hand, was harder to miss. The German Shepherd's lean, muscular frame and intense gaze demanded a second look. His fur, a striking mix of black and tan, gleamed even in the dim light of the diner's parking lot. He walked in perfect sync with James, always by his side, his alertness unmistakable. To James, Max wasn't just a dog, he was a partner, a protector, and, above all, family. The pair had been through a lot together. Though James didn't talk much about his past, it lingered in his every movement. The faint scars on his hands and the slight stiffness in his gait hinted at a life that had seen both discipline and danger. For years, James had served his country, traveling to places most people only read about in headlines. Max had been there too, serving alongside him. But those days were behind them now. They had traded the chaos of war for the quiet of the open road. The diner was one of those places that hadn't changed in decades. Its neon sign flickered weakly against the early evening sky, and the smell of fried food wafted into the parking lot. Inside, James knew what he would find: plastic booths, a jukebox playing old country songs, and the kind of waitresses who called everyone honey. It was the sort of spot where nobody asked too many questions, which suited James just fine. As they approached the entrance, Max walked slightly ahead, his ears twitching at every sound. James gave him a gentle pat on the head, a silent signal that everything was okay. But even as they reached the door, James felt it: a shift in the atmosphere, a subtle weight in the air. Then came the sound that confirmed his unease, the low, rumbling growl of motorcycles pulling into the lot. James didn't turn around right away, but he didn't have to. He knew that sound all too well. It wasn't just the noise of engines, it was the noise of a group that thrived on being noticed, on making others uncomfortable. The motorcycles rolled in one by one, their riders clad in leather jackets and boots that clinked against the pavement. The bikes were big, loud, and covered in custom paint jobs that screamed for attention. James glanced over his shoulder, just enough to see them park in a line, like a row of steel and chrome predators. The bikers dismounted, their voices carrying across the lot as they joked and jeered with each other. There were about 6 of them, and they moved with a kind of swagger that was hard to ignore. James recognized the type instantly. They weren't here for the food or the coffee. They were here to be seen, to take up space, to remind everyone that this was their territory even if it wasn't. James turned back toward the diner door, pushing it open and stepping inside. The warm air and the smell of bacon greeted him, but he couldn't shake the feeling that trouble had just walked in behind him. Max stayed close, his head turning slightly to glance at the bikers before following James to a booth near the window. The diner wasn't crowded, just a few families and truckers scattered at the tables. A waitress with a tired but kind face came over, her notepad in hand. "What can I get you, Han?" she asked, her smile genuine. James ordered a coffee and a burger, keeping his tone polite but brief. The waitress glanced at Max and raised an eyebrow. "We don't usually allow dogs, but he seems well behaved." "He is," James replied simply. "He's with me." The waitress nodded, sensing there was more to the story but deciding not to press. She walked away, leaving James and Max to settle in. Outside, the bikers were still in the lot, their laughter and voices growing louder as they lingered near their bikes. James watched them through the window, his expression unreadable. He wasn't looking for a fight, but he wasn't the type to back down if one came his way. Max seemed to sense the tension too. He sat upright, his eyes fixed on the group, his body language calm but ready. James took a sip of his coffee, his mind briefly drifting to memories of similar situations, places where the stakes had been higher, where the outcomes had been more dire. He had faced worse than a group of loud bikers, but that didn't mean he underestimated them. He knew that trouble often came from the places you least expected, and it usually came when you let your guard down. The sound of the diner door opening snapped him back to the present. The bikers had come inside. Their voices filled the room, a stark contrast to the quiet conversations of the other patrons. They walked in like they owned the place, their boots thudding heavily against the floor. James didn't look up right away. He kept his eyes on his plate, focusing on his meal. Max stayed by his side, but his ears perked up, his sharp instincts kicking in. The bikers claimed a table near the counter, their laughter and loud voices disrupting the diner's usual calm. One of them glanced in James's direction, nudging his friend and muttering something under his breath. The others laughed, their eyes darting toward James and Max. James felt the weight of their stares but didn't react. He had learned long ago that the best way to handle situations like this was to stay calm, to let them make the first move if they were bold enough. Max, ever loyal, stayed close, his presence a silent reassurance. It was just another day, James told himself. But deep down, he knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. The bikers made themselves comfortable, throwing their leather-clad jackets over the backs of the chairs and spreading out as though they owned the diner. The waitress, who had been warm and polite with James, approached their table hesitantly. Her tired smile faltered just slightly, but she kept her composure. "What'll it be, boys?" she asked, her pen poised over her notepad. "Coffee. Black. And don't let it sit too long this time," one of the bikers said, smirking. Another chimed in, "Yeah, and make it quick, sweetheart. We don't have all night." Their laughter was loud and harsh, cutting through the soft hum of conversation in the diner. A couple sitting near the door exchanged glances and quietly gathered their things, leaving a few dollars on the table before slipping out. James noticed, but he didn't move. Instead, he focused on Max, who had laid down at his feet but remained alert. James reached down to scratch behind Max's ears, a quiet signal that everything was still under control. The bikers weren't done making their presence known. One of them, a tall, lanky man with a scruffy beard and a patch over his left eye, looked around the diner with a cocky grin. His gaze landed on James, lingering for just a moment before shifting to Max. "Hey, check it out," the man said, nudging his buddy. "Looks like we got a tough guy over there." And he brought his mud along for backup. The others turned to look, their smirks widening as they took in James's calm demeanor and Max's unwavering focus. James didn't respond. He didn't even look up. Years of training had taught him that reactions only fueled people like this. Instead, he took another sip of his coffee, letting the warmth of the mug steady him. "Hey, I'm talking to you," the man called out, his voice louder now. "What's the matter? Too good to say hi?" Max's ears twitched, and a low growl rumbled in his throat. It was soft, almost imperceptible, but James felt it through the floor. He placed a hand on Max's back, a silent command to stay calm. The waitress returned with the biker's coffee, placing the mugs on the table with quick, practiced movements. "Here you go," she said, her voice a little shaky now. "Where's the sugar?" one of them asked, his tone mocking. "It's on the table," she replied, gesturing to the small container right in front of him. The man chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "Oh, I see it. Just wanted to make sure you were paying attention." The group erupted into laughter again, and the waitress quickly stepped away, her face flushed. James watched the exchange from the corner of his eye, his jaw tightening just slightly. He didn't like bullies, never had, never would. But he also knew better than to escalate a situation that didn't need escalating. For now, he stayed quiet, trusting that the bikers would get bored and move on. But boredom wasn't what they were after. The man with the patch stood up, stretching his arms over his head before sauntering over to James's table. The other bikers watched, their smirks turning into full-blown grins. Well, Patch said, stopping a few feet away. What's your story, old man? You passing through, or you sticking around to entertain us? James looked up slowly, meeting the man's gaze with a calm but steady expression. He didn't say anything, letting the silence do the talking. Patch laughed, a harsh sound that grated on the ears. Cat got your tongue? Or is it the dog? That's a good-looking mutt you got there. What's his name? James's voice was low but firm when he finally spoke. His name's Max. And he doesn't like people getting too close. Patch raised his hands in mock surrender, taking a small step back. Easy there, cowboy. I'm just making conversation. One of the other bikers called out from their table, maybe he's scared, Patch. You know how these types are, quiet until you poke 'em, and then they start barking. The group roared with laughter again, the sound filling the diner like an unwanted storm. James remained composed, but his grip on the coffee mug tightened just slightly. He glanced down at Max, who was watching Patch intently, his body coiled like a spring. Why don't you go back to your table and leave us alone? James said, his tone even but laced with quiet authority. Patch tilted his head, considering the suggestion for a moment. Then he leaned in just slightly, a smug grin spreading across his face. Why don't you make me? The diner grew silent. Even the jukebox seemed to pause, the song fading into the background as tension filled the room. The other patrons sat frozen, their eyes darting between James and Patch, waiting to see what would happen next. James didn't move. His gaze stayed locked on Patch, unflinching. You don't want to do this, he said simply. Patch's grin faltered for a fraction of a second, but he quickly recovered. Oh, I think I do. You see, I don't like it when people think they're better than me. And you? Sitting here all quiet with your fancy dog? You think you're better than me, don't you? James sighed quietly, setting his mug down on the table. I don't think about you at all, he replied. The calmness in his voice seemed to throw Patch off balance, and for a moment, he hesitated. But the laughter and jeers from his friends pushed him forward. What do you say, tough guy? Patch continued, taking another step closer. You gonna stand up, or are you gonna let your dog do all the work? Max's growl grew louder, his lips pulling back just enough to show his sharp teeth. Max, James said softly, his tone firm but calm. The dog immediately quieted, though his body remained tense. Patch chuckled nervously, glancing down at Max before looking back at James. Yeah, that's what I thought, he said, his voice not quite as confident as before. The waitress, who had been standing near the counter, finally stepped in. Hey, that's enough, she said, her voice trembling but determined. If you're not gonna order food, you need to leave. We don't want any trouble here. Patch turned to her, his grin returning. Trouble? Lady, we're just having a little fun. Ain't that right, old man? James didn't respond. He leaned back in his seat, crossing his arms as he waited to see what Patch would do next. The other bikers called out from their table, urging Patch to come back and leave James alone. He's not worth it, man, one of them said, laughing. Come on, let's get out of here. For a moment, it seemed like Patch might listen. But then he turned back to James, his expression darkening. You're lucky my friends are in a good mood, he said, pointing a finger at James. but don't think this is over. With that, he stepped back, retreating to his table amid the laughter and cheers of his group. James let out a slow breath, his shoulders relaxing just slightly. He reached down to pat Max's head, murmuring something only the dog could hear. Max's ears twitched, but his eyes remained locked on the bikers. The waitress gave James an apologetic look as she approached his table again. "I'm so sorry about them," she said quietly. "They come in every now and then, always causing trouble. If you want, I can get your food to go." James shook his head. "No need. We're fine right here." The waitress nodded, though she still looked worried. "Well, if you need anything, just let me know." James thanked her and turned his attention back to his coffee. He knew the bikers weren't done yet. People like that rarely were. But he also knew that he and Max were more than capable of handling whatever came next. For now, he would wait. The storm was brewing, but James Carter wasn't the type to run from it. The bikers entered the diner like they owned the place, their heavy boots thudding against the worn linoleum floor. Their leather jackets were adorned with patches and symbols that hinted at their reputation: wings, skulls, and names stitched in bold, defiant letters. The air seemed to shift as their voices rose, filling the room with boisterous laughter and crude jokes. For a moment, the soft chatter of the other patrons died away, replaced by the uneasy energy that followed the group wherever they went. James didn't look up. He had no interest in whatever game they were trying to play. He focused on his plate, cutting into his burger with steady hands. But Max, ever alert, shifted slightly under the table. His keen instincts told him something wasn't right, and his sharp eyes flicked toward the group. The leader of the bikers, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a scruffy beard and piercing blue eyes, scanned the room. His gaze landed on James, lingering just a second too long. A sneer curled his lips. "Well, what do we have here?" he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "What's a guy like you doing in a place like this?" James didn't respond. He didn't even flinch. Years of discipline had taught him to stay calm under pressure, to avoid giving troublemakers the reaction they craved. "Hey, I'm talking to you," the man said, taking a step closer. His boots squeaked slightly against the floor, and the sound seemed to echo in the tense silence of the diner. "What's the matter? You deaf, old man?" The group erupted in laughter, their voices carrying a mocking edge. One of them, a wiry guy with a toothpick dangling from his lips, slapped the leader on the back. "Maybe he's just shy, Bones," he said, grinning. Bones tilted his head, studying James like a predator sizing up its prey. "Or maybe he thinks he's too good for us," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Max's ears perked up, and he shifted again, this time placing one paw in front of the other as if readying himself to act. James reached down, his hand finding the soft fur behind Max's ears. It was a subtle gesture, one that said, "Not yet." The waitress, who had been hovering near the counter, stepped forward hesitantly. Her hands clutched her notepad tightly, and her smile was more nervous than kind. "Can I get you boys something?" she asked, trying to redirect their attention. Bones glanced at her, his expression softening slightly. "Yeah, we'll take some coffee," he said, his voice smoother now. "And maybe you can bring us a slice of that pie too. Looks like a good night for dessert." The waitress nodded quickly and turned away, eager to escape the group's overbearing presence. But Bones wasn't done with James. He turned back, his smirk returning. "So, what's your deal?" he asked, leaning against the edge of the booth. "Just passing through, or are you planning to stick around and grace us with your charming personality?" James finally looked up, his eyes meeting Bones'. His expression was calm, almost indifferent, but there was an unmistakable weight behind his gaze. "Just passing through," he said simply, his voice steady. "Just passing through," Bones repeated, mimicking James's tone. He straightened up, his smirk widening. "Well, aren't you the mysterious type?" The rest of the bikers chuckled, their laughter blending with the faint hum of the jukebox in the background. One of them, a stocky man with a shaved head and a scar running down his cheek, pointed at Max. "Nice dog," he said, his voice gruff. "Bet he's got more bite than you do." The group roared with laughter again, and the sound grated against James's nerves. He took another bite of his burger, ignoring the comment. Max, however, wasn't so quick to dismiss the insult. His growl was low and quiet, but it was enough to make the scarred biker take a step back. "Whoa," the man said, raising his hands. "Easy, boy. Don't want any trouble." Bones laughed, slapping his friend on the shoulder. "Looks like the dog's got more guts than his owner," he said. James set his fork down slowly, his movements deliberate. He wiped his hands on a napkin before speaking. "Max doesn't like people getting too close," he said, his tone calm but firm. "And neither do I." The laughter died down, replaced by a tense silence. For a moment, it seemed like Bones might back off. But then his smirk returned, and he leaned in closer. "Is that right?" he said, his voice low. "Well, maybe we ought to test just how tough you and your dog really are." Before James could respond, the waitress returned with a tray of coffee mugs. She placed them on the biker's table with trembling hands, her eyes darting nervously between James and Bones. "Here you go," she said quickly, stepping back as soon as the last mug was down. Bones grabbed his coffee and took a sip, his eyes never leaving James. "You know," he said, setting the mug down with a clink, "I don't like it when people think they're better than me. And you? Sitting there all quiet, acting like you're too good to talk to us? That rubs me the wrong way." James leaned back in his seat, his arms crossing over his chest. "I'm just trying to enjoy my meal," he said. "You should do the same." Bones' smirk faltered for a split second, but he quickly recovered. "You got a smart mouth, old man," he said, his tone colder now. The scarred biker chuckled, pulling his chair closer to their table. "Maybe we ought to teach him some manners," he said. The tension in the diner was thick now, so heavy that even the other patrons could feel it. A trucker sitting near the counter shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the door as if debating whether to leave. James stayed still, his calm exterior masking the storm that was building inside him. He had been in situations like this before, too many to count. He knew how quickly things could escalate, and he knew how to handle himself if they did. Max, ever loyal, stayed at his side, his muscles coiled and ready. His growl had stopped, but his eyes remained locked on the group, watching their every move. Bones leaned closer, his hands resting on the edge of the table. "What do you say, old man?" he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You gonna show us some respect, or are we gonna have to take it?" James met his gaze, unflinching. "You don't want to do this," he said quietly. The room seemed to hold its breath, every eye in the diner fixed on the two men. Even the jukebox had gone silent, the last notes of the country song fading into the background. For a moment, it seemed like Bones might back down. But then he grinned, a wicked glint in his eyes. "Oh, I think I do," he said. The scarred biker stood up, cracking his knuckles. The others followed suit, their chairs scraping loudly against the floor. James didn't move. He stayed seated, his hands resting lightly on the table. But there was a shift in his posture, a subtle change that only someone trained to notice would catch. The waitress stepped forward again, her voice trembling. "That's enough," she said, her eyes pleading. "You're scaring everyone. Just leave him alone." Bones turned to her, his grin softening into something almost charming. "Relax, sweetheart," he said. "We're just having a little fun. Isn't that right, old man?" James didn't respond. Instead, he reached down to pat Max's head, his fingers brushing against the dog's fur. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes. The silence stretched on, heavy and oppressive. The bikers waited, their eyes gleaming with anticipation. But James didn't give them what they wanted. And that only made them angrier. The tension in the room was suffocating. Every eye in the diner flicked between James and the bikers, waiting for the inevitable spark that would ignite the confrontation. The waitress, still clutching her notepad, took a step back, her lips pressed into a thin line of worry. Bones straightened, his smirk fading into something colder, more calculated. He grabbed a chair from a nearby table and spun it around, sitting on it backward. His arms draped casually over the backrest, but his eyes never left James. "You've got guts, I'll give you that," he said, his tone low and deliberate. "Most people would have folded by now. But not you, huh?" James remained calm, his eyes fixed on the man in front of him. He could feel Max tense beside him, the dog's instincts sharp as ever. "I've seen enough bullies in my time to know how they operate," James replied evenly. "You bark loud, but that's all it is, noise." A murmur rippled through the diner. Some of the other patrons exchanged nervous glances, their unease growing. One older man, seated at the counter, shook his head and muttered under his breath, "This won't end well." Bones' jaw tightened, his casual facade cracking for the first time. "You've got a smart mouth," he said, his voice carrying an edge of danger. "But out here? Words don't mean much. Then why are you still talking?" James shot back, his tone firm but controlled. The room went silent again, the weight of James's words hanging in the air. Bones' crew shifted uncomfortably, clearly unaccustomed to someone standing up to their leader. The scarred biker, still hovering nearby, leaned in with a sneer. "You think you're tough, huh? Sitting there all cool like you don't care. Let me tell you something." Before he could finish, Max let out a sharp, guttural bark that echoed through the diner. The sound was so sudden and fierce that it made the man flinch, his bravado faltering. Bones chuckled darkly, leaning back in his chair. "Looks like your dog's got more fight in him than you do," he said. James's eyes narrowed. "Max doesn't fight without a reason," he said. "But he'll protect what matters." Bones' smirk returned, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Well, maybe we ought to see just how good your dog is at protecting you," he said, standing up and towering over the booth. The tension snapped like a taut rope. One of the bikers moved forward, his heavy boots thudding against the floor. Max growled, his teeth bared, but James placed a calming hand on the dog's back. "Enough," James said, his voice carrying a quiet authority that made even Bones hesitate for a fraction of a second. "You've had your fun. Now walk away." Bones' expression darkened, the playful arrogance draining from his face. "You think you can tell me what to do," he said, his voice rising. James didn't flinch. He had faced men like this before, men who thrived on intimidation, who mistook fear for respect. But James wasn't afraid. Not of Bones, not of his crew, not of anyone. "Not telling," James said. "I'm advising." The scarred biker let out a bark of laughter. "Advising? This guy's full of himself," he said, looking to his companions for support. But Bones wasn't laughing anymore. He stepped closer, his fists clenched, and for a moment, it seemed like he might take a swing. Max's growl deepened, his body coiled like a spring ready to snap. His eyes locked onto Bones, unblinking and fierce. The waitress stepped forward again, her voice trembling but determined. "Please, just leave him alone," she said. "He hasn't done anything to you." Bones turned to her, his expression softening slightly. "We're just having a little fun," he said, his tone almost soothing. But when he turned back to James, the menace in his eyes was unmistakable. James tilted his head, studying Bones with a calm intensity. "You don't want to do this," he said again, his voice steady and measured. "And why's that?" Bones challenged, his tone dripping with mockery. "Because you have no idea who you're dealing with," James said, his words quiet but heavy with meaning. The room seemed to freeze. The other patrons leaned forward, their curiosity piqued. Even the bikers paused, their bravado momentarily replaced by uncertainty. Bones' eyes narrowed, his confidence faltering for the briefest of moments. But he quickly shook it off, his smirk returning. "You think you're some kind of big shot," he said. "Let me guess, retired cop? Ex-military? That's supposed to scare me." James didn't respond. He simply leaned back in his seat, his calm demeanor unshaken. Bones laughed, but it was forced, lacking the conviction of before. "You're nothing," he said, pointing a finger at James. "Just another washed-up nobody trying to act tough." James's lips curled into a faint smile. "If that's what you believe, then walk away," he said. The scarred biker stepped forward, his fists clenched. "Enough talking," he growled. "Let's teach this guy a lesson." Before anyone could react, Max lunged forward, his bark sharp and commanding. He didn't bite, didn't attack, but the sheer force of his presence was enough to stop the biker in his tracks. The room erupted into chaos. Patrons scrambled to move away, chairs screeching against the floor as people sought refuge behind counters and booths. James stood slowly, his full height revealing a quiet strength that had been hidden under his unassuming demeanor. He placed a firm hand on Max's collar, holding the dog back while keeping his gaze locked on Bones. "You've had your chance," James said, his voice calm but deadly serious. "Now it's time for you to leave." Bones hesitated, his confidence shaken. His crew looked to him for guidance, their bravado fading in the face of James's quiet defiance and Max's undeniable presence. For a moment, it seemed like Bones might push forward, might test the limits of this strange, quiet man and his formidable dog. But something in James's eyes made him pause, a depth of experience, of knowledge, that spoke of battles fought and lessons learned the hard way. With a frustrated growl, Bones stepped back, raising his hands in mock surrender. "Fine," he said. "You win this round, old man. But don't think for a second that we're done here." He turned to his crew, jerking his head toward the door. "Let's go," he said, his tone sharp. The bikers hesitated but eventually followed, their footsteps heavy with reluctance. As they filed out of the diner, Bones shot one last glare at James. "Next time, you won't be so lucky," he said. James didn't respond. He simply watched as the group disappeared into the night, the roar of their motorcycles fading into the distance. The diner fell silent, the tension lingering like a heavy fog. Slowly, the patrons began to relax, their whispered conversations filling the air once more. The waitress approached James cautiously, her hands still trembling. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. James nodded, his expression calm. "We're fine," he said, glancing down at Max. The dog had already settled back into his calm demeanor, his head resting on his paws. The waitress managed a small smile. "Thank you," she said. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't stood up to them." James didn't respond right away. He simply patted Max's head, his thoughts elsewhere. This wasn't the first time he'd encountered men like Bones, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. But as he looked around the diner, at the relieved faces of the other patrons, he knew one thing for certain: he and Max would always be ready. The diner air grew heavier with tension. James's calm response only deepened the bikers' amusement, but beneath their laughter, unease flickered. The leader, who went by the nickname Tank, straightened, his massive frame towering over the booth where James sat. He glanced at his crew, signaling it was time to escalate. "Wouldn't do that if I were you," Tank mimicked, his voice dripping with mockery. What, is this mud some kind of secret weapon? James met his gaze, his expression unreadable. Max doesn't bite unless he has to, he said simply. Tank leaned in closer, his face inches from Max. Let's see if he's got the guts. Max didn't flinch. Instead, his growl deepened, a sound so primal it made the nearest biker step back instinctively. Tank hesitated for a split second before his ego kicked back in, and he forced a chuckle. Cute trick, he said, standing upright. But it'll take more than that to scare me. As the tension mounted, one of the bikers, a wiry man with shifty eyes, nudged Tank. Boss, maybe we should just leave it. This guy's weird, and that dog. I don't know, man. Tank shot him a glare that silenced him immediately. Weird, huh? You scared of a guy who won't even fight back? James, still seated, leaned slightly forward, his tone low but firm. It's not about being scared. It's about knowing when to walk away. The other patrons in the diner watched with bated breath, some ducking their heads to avoid drawing attention. But one older man, who had been nursing a coffee at the counter, muttered just loud enough for those nearby to hear, "He's smarter than they think." Tank slammed his hand on the table, making Max's ears twitch but not much else. "You think you're smarter than me, old man," he growled. "Think you're better?" James looked up, his eyes calm but piercing. "I think I've seen enough fights to know who wins. And it's not the loudest guy in the room." That statement landed like a blow. Tank's bravado faltered, but he quickly masked it with a laugh, gesturing to his crew. "This guy's got jokes. Maybe we'll stick around a little longer." One of the younger bikers, a lanky man with a nervous energy, seemed less eager. "Tank, we've got places to be," he muttered, casting a wary glance at Max. "Shut it, rookie," Tank snapped. James leaned back in his seat, his gaze steady. "Max and I were just passing through," he said. "We're not looking for trouble. But if you keep pushing, you'll find out why that's a bad idea." There was that tone again, controlled, unwavering, with an edge that hinted at something far deeper than the surface suggested. Even the other bikers felt it now, a creeping doubt they couldn't shake. Tank, however, was too far into his performance to back down. "Oh, I'm shaking," he said, smirking. "Let me guess, you're some kind of war hero? Got medals at home and stories to tell?" James didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he reached down and scratched Max behind the ears, his actions calm and deliberate. "I don't talk about the past," he said. "But Max and I, we've seen things. Done things. Things you wouldn't understand." The words hung in the air, heavier than any threat. Tank's expression hardened. "Yeah? Like what?" James didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small coin, flipping it between his fingers. It was old and weathered, the edges worn smooth. When Tank and the others saw the emblem engraved on it, a military insignia, they froze. "You recognize this?" James asked, his tone still calm. Tank's bravado faltered. He didn't say anything, but the look in his eyes betrayed a flicker of recognition. One of the older bikers, who had been silent until now, stepped forward. That's a challenge coin," he said quietly. "Special Forces." The diner grew even quieter. The realization hit like a thunderclap. This wasn't just some random guy on the road. Tank's smirk faded completely, replaced by a defensive scowl. "So what? You're a soldier? Big deal. Doesn't mean anything here." James pocketed the coin and stood slowly, his movements deliberate. He was taller than he appeared sitting down, his posture straight and commanding. Max stood with him, his presence as steady as ever. "It means I know how to pick my battles," James said. "And I'm telling you, you don't want this one. The older biker nodded, stepping back. Tank, let's just go. This ain't worth it. But Tank wasn't ready to give up. His pride was on the line, and he wasn't about to back down in front of his crew. You think a fancy coin and a big dog make you untouchable, he sneered. James tilted his head slightly, his gaze never wavering. No, he said. But the training that earned me that coin? That might. The statement was delivered with such quiet certainty that it sent a chill through the room. Even the most skeptical bikers began to reconsider. Tank clenched his fists, his internal struggle evident. He wanted to fight, to prove his dominance, but something about James, the way he carried himself, the way he spoke, made him hesitate. Max, sensing the shifting energy, let out a short bark, as if to punctuate James's words. The waitress, who had been frozen in the corner, finally found her voice. Please, she said, her tone pleading. Just leave. No one wants this to get worse. Tank looked around, his bravado crumbling under the weight of the growing realization that he was outmatched. With a frustrated growl, he turned to his crew. Let's go, he snapped. The bikers hesitated but ultimately followed, their collective relief palpable. As they filed out of the diner, Tank threw one last glare over his shoulder. This isn't over, he muttered. James watched them go, his expression unreadable. Only when the roar of their motorcycles faded into the distance did he relax, lowering himself back into his seat. Max settled beside him, his calm demeanor returning as if nothing had happened. The patrons slowly returned to their meals, the tension dissipating but not forgotten. The older man at the counter raised his coffee in a silent toast to James. The waitress approached cautiously, her voice trembling. Are you okay? James nodded. We're fine. She hesitated. That coin, you really were special forces. James didn't answer directly. Instead, he patted Max on the head. Max was, he said. Her eyes widened. The dog. James smiled faintly. He's not just any dog. He's a hero. And with that, the story shifted. The bikers had underestimated James and Max, but they weren't the first, and they wouldn't be the last. The waitress stood there, stunned by James's words, her eyes darting between him and Max. A hero, she whispered, as if the weight of that revelation needed to be treated delicately. James didn't elaborate immediately. Instead, he reached for his glass of water, taking a measured sip. Max, still alert but visibly calmer, sat beside him like a sentinel on duty. The older man at the counter chuckled softly, breaking the growing silence. I knew there was something different about you, he said, turning on his stool to face James. You carry yourself like someone who's been through the ringer and come out the other side. James looked over at him, offering a faint nod. Something like that, he replied. The waitress leaned in, unable to contain her curiosity any longer. What do you mean Max is a hero? What did he do? James glanced down at Max, his fingers absently scratching behind the dog's ears. Max isn't just a dog. He's a military working dog. Served multiple tours overseas, just like me. Saved lives more than I can count. The waitress's hand flew to her mouth. Oh my God. I had no idea. James's tone remained even, but there was a hint of pride as he continued. He's trained to detect danger bombs, enemies, you name it. And when it came down to it, he never hesitated to protect his team. Max is the reason I'm still here today. The older man let out a low whistle. That explains a lot. That growl of his gave me chills. Max let out a quiet woof, as if acknowledging the praise. The waitress crouched slightly, lowering herself to Max's level. You're incredible, aren't you, boy, she said softly. Max tilted his head, his intelligent eyes studying her before giving a single wag of his tail. James smiled faintly. He likes you. That's not something he does for everyone. The waitress's face lit up, but before she could say more, the older man at the counter interrupted. Those bikers, they've caused trouble around here before. Thought they owned the place. But I've never seen anyone shut them down like you did. James shrugged. Bullies are all the same. They back off when they realize they're outmatched. The waitress frowned. But what if they come back? Tank didn't seem like the type to just let things go. James's expression hardened slightly. If they do, we'll be ready. The confidence in his voice reassured her, though a small seed of worry remained. As the waitress moved to check on other customers, the older man leaned closer. You've got the look of someone who's seen a lot, son, he said. And that dog of yours? I'd wager he's seen just as much, if not more. James nodded slowly. We've been through it together. Max was with me on every mission, every patrol. When you trust someone with your life like that, it forms a bond you can't break. The older man's eyes softened. I respect that. You and Max, you're the kind of people, well, the kind of team we need more of in this world. James gave him a small smile, but before he could respond, the bell above the diner door jingled. Everyone tensed for a moment, but it wasn't the bikers. Instead, a young couple walked in, their chatter light and oblivious to the tension that had just hung over the room. The waitress visibly relaxed, returning to her duties, but James remained vigilant. His years in the military had trained him to stay aware of his surroundings, and Max's sharp instincts only amplified that readiness. The older man sipped his coffee, watching James closely. You know, he said, breaking the silence again, there's a saying about men like you. Quiet waters run deep. You don't say much, but when you do, well, it carries weight. James chuckled softly. I've found that words are most effective when you don't use too many of them. The man laughed. Fair enough. As the minutes ticked by, the atmosphere in the diner began to lighten. Conversations resumed, the clatter of plates and silverware filled the space, and the earlier tension seemed like a distant memory. But James knew better. Tank's parting words weren't idle threats. Men like him thrived on dominance, and the sting of being outmaneuvered in front of his crew would eat at him. Max shifted at James's feet, his ears twitching. James glanced down, sensing the dog's unease. He reached down to reassure him with a gentle pat. You feel it too, don't you, buddy? He murmured. The older man caught the exchange. You think they'll come back? James didn't answer immediately. Instead, he met the man's gaze, his expression thoughtful. If they do, they'll be making a mistake. The man nodded, his respect for James evident. Well, if it comes to that, you've got at least one guy in your corner. James gave him a small nod of appreciation, but his focus remained on Max. The dog's instincts were rarely wrong, and James had learned to trust them implicitly. As the evening wore on, the diner slowly began to empty. The young couple left first, then the older man, who offered a final nod to James before stepping out into the night. The waitress approached with the check, her smile warm but tinged with lingering worry. I hope you and Max have a safe trip, she said. James took the check, his expression calm. We will. Thanks for everything. As he and Max prepared to leave, James's thoughts were already turning to the road ahead. But deep down, he knew this wasn't over. Tank and his crew weren't the type to let a perceived slight go unanswered. And when they returned because James was certain he and Max would be ready. For now, though, the road awaited. And as the two stepped out into the cool night air, the bond between man and dog felt stronger than ever, a silent promise that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The air in the diner turned electric, charged with the weight of James's revelation. Tank's cocky grin faded as his eyes darted between the metal in James's hand and the imposing figure of Max, who stood poised like a soldier awaiting orders. The younger biker, the one who had hesitated earlier, spoke up, his voice shaking. "Boss. I think we should go." Tank turned to him with a glare that could cut steel. "Shut up," he barked, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. He was trying to hold onto his bravado, but it was slipping through his fingers like sand. James didn't flinch. He stepped out from the booth, his movements calm but deliberate, each step carrying a quiet intensity. Max remained at his side, his gaze fixed on Tank, every muscle in his body taut with readiness. "Let me make this clear," James said, his voice steady and firm. "Max and I didn't come here looking for trouble. But we don't run from it, either." He held up the medal, letting the light catch the engraved emblem. The room seemed to shrink as every eye focused on it. "This is the Distinguished Service Cross," James continued. "It's given to soldiers who show extraordinary heroism in combat. Max and I earned it together." A murmur spread through the few remaining patrons in the diner. Even the waitress, who had been hovering nervously behind the counter, looked on with wide eyes. James took a step closer to Tank, the medal still in his hand. "You think you're tough because you ride in a group and intimidate people? Let me tell you something. Tough isn't picking fights with strangers. Tough is being in the middle of a firefight, knowing you might not make it out, and still putting yourself on the line to save the people around you." Tank swallowed hard, his swagger dissolving under the weight of James's words. The older biker who had recognized the challenge coin earlier stepped forward, placing a hand on Tank's shoulder. "He's right, Tank. Let it go. This isn't a fight we can win." But Tank wasn't ready to admit defeat. His pride was a beast that wouldn't go down without a fight. "So what? You're a war hero? Big deal," he spat, though the crack in his voice betrayed his fear. "That doesn't mean anything now." James's gaze hardened. "It means I know how to handle people like you." He gestured to Max, whose low growl punctuated the statement. "And it means Max does, too." The tension reached its peak as Tank's hand twitched toward his belt, where a sheath knife hung. The movement didn't escape Max, who let out a sharp bark, stepping forward in a move so precise it was clear he was responding to a command that James hadn't even voiced aloud. "Don't," James warned, his tone deadly calm. "You don't want to see what happens if you push this any further." The room was silent except for the faint hum of the diner's fluorescent lights. Tank's hand hovered near the knife, his face a mask of indecision. The older biker tightened his grip on Tank's shoulder. "Tank, enough," he said, his voice firm. "We've already lost this one. Let's go." For a long moment, it seemed like Tank might ignore him. His jaw worked furiously, his ego waging war with his instincts. But finally, with a muttered curse, he dropped his hand and stepped back. "This ain't over," he growled, pointing a finger at James. "You'll regret this." James didn't move, his steady gaze locked on Tank. "If you're smart, you'll make sure it is over. Because next time, I won't be as forgiving." The bikers began to shuffle out, their earlier bravado replaced with an uneasy silence. As the door closed behind them, the tension in the diner finally began to dissipate. The waitress let out a shaky breath, leaning against the counter for support. "That was intense," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. James returned to his seat, his expression calm once more. Max settled beside him, his posture relaxed but his eyes still scanning the room. The older man at the counter chuckled, breaking the silence. "I've seen a lot in my time, but that takes the cake." He raised his coffee mug in a toast. "Here's to you, Sergeant Carter, and to Max." James gave him a small nod, his lips curving into the faintest of smiles. "Thanks," he said simply. The waitress approached cautiously, her hands trembling slightly as she refilled James's coffee. "I've never seen anyone stand up to them like that," she said. "You and Max, you're incredible." James shrugged, his tone humble. "We just do what needs to be done." The older man leaned in, his eyes twinkling with curiosity. "So, tell me, Sergeant, how does a man like you end up in a place like this?" James took a sip of his coffee before replying. "Sometimes, after everything you've seen and done, you just need a little peace and quiet. But peace doesn't always come easy." The older man nodded knowingly. "Ain't that the truth?" As the minutes ticked by, the tension in the diner gave way to a quiet sense of camaraderie. The patrons who remained exchanged glances, their respect for James and Max evident. Outside, the distant roar of motorcycles faded into the night, leaving only the hum of the diner's neon sign and the steady rhythm of Max's breathing. For James and Max, the moment was just another chapter in a long story of challenges faced and battles won. And as they prepared to hit the road again, one thing was certain: no matter what lay ahead, they would face it together, as they always had. Because some bonds are forged in fire, and those bonds, like the one between James and Max, are unbreakable. Tank and his crew disappeared into the night, but their parting threat lingered in the air like smoke. James leaned back in his booth, his eyes narrowing as he glanced down at Max. The German shepherd lay at his feet, calm but alert, his ears twitching as if he too could sense the unfinished business hanging in the balance. The older man at the counter took another sip of his coffee, shaking his head. "You've got a way about you, Sergeant. The kind that makes men like Tank think twice before pulling anything stupid. But don't underestimate their stubbornness." James gave a small nod. "Men like him thrive on intimidation. When that doesn't work, they tend to double down." His voice was calm, almost detached, but the weight of experience lay behind his words. He'd faced men far more dangerous than Tank and his crew. The waitress approached cautiously, a fresh pot of coffee in hand. "You really think they'll come back?" she asked, her voice tinged with worry. James didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached down to scratch Max behind the ears. "I don't think they'll be able to help themselves," he said finally. "People like Tank can't handle losing face. They'll want to prove they're still in charge." The waitress's brow furrowed. "What are you going to do if they do come back?" James looked at her, his gaze steady. "What needs to be done?" The older man let out a low chuckle. "I'd hate to be on the receiving end of that. You've got the look of a man who doesn't start fights but definitely knows how to end them." James didn't respond, but his faint smirk said enough. The hours ticked by, and the diner began to empty out. The older man bid James farewell, tipping his hat before heading out into the night. The waitress continued her duties, stealing glances at James and Max, her curiosity about their story evident but unspoken. As the clock struck midnight, the bell above the door jingled again. James's body tensed instinctively, his senses sharp. But it wasn't the bikers. A young man in a mechanic's uniform walked in, offering a sheepish smile to the waitress before taking a seat at the counter. James relaxed slightly, but his vigilance never fully faded. He'd learned long ago to trust his instincts, and right now, they were telling him that the night wasn't over yet. It was just past 2 a.m. when the sound of motorcycles shattered the stillness of the night. James, who had been nursing a cup of coffee, set it down slowly. Max's ears perked up, his posture shifting as he turned toward the door. The waitress froze mid-step, her eyes widening in fear. "They're back," she whispered, her voice barely audible. James stood, his movements deliberate. He placed a few bills on the table, enough to cover his meal and a generous tip. "Stay behind the counter," he said to the waitress, his tone leaving no room for argument. The roar of engines grew louder, the headlights of the motorcycles casting eerie shadows on the walls of the diner. One by one, the bikes came to a halt just outside, their riders dismounting with practiced ease. Tank was at the front, his expression dark and vengeful. James pushed open the diner door and stepped outside, Max following closely at his side. The cool night air was heavy with tension as the bikers fanned out, their postures aggressive. Tank took a step forward, his knife now unsheathed and glinting under the moonlight. "You thought you could humiliate me and get away with it?" Tank snarled, his voice dripping with venom. "You don't know who you're messing with." James remained calm, his hands at his sides, his stance relaxed but ready. "No, Tank," he said evenly. "It's you who doesn't know who you're messing with." Max growled low, the sound deep and menacing. One of the bikers flinched, his confidence faltering as he glanced at the dog. Tank sneered. "You think that mud scares me," he said, his bravado masking the unease that flickered in his eyes. "It's just a dog." James's expression hardened. "Max isn't just a dog. He's a soldier. And so am I. That makes you very outmatched." Tank lunged, his knife aimed directly at James. But before the blade could reach its target, Max sprang into action. With a speed and precision honed by years of training, the German Shepherd intercepted Tank, knocking the knife from his hand and pinning him to the ground. The other bikers froze, stunned by the sudden turn of events. James stepped forward, his voice sharp and commanding. "Enough," he barked. "This ends now." Tank struggled beneath Max's weight, his bravado replaced by panic. "Get this dog off me," he yelled, his voice cracking. James knelt down, his expression cold. "You had your chance to walk away. You chose not to take it." He gestured to Max, who growled once more before releasing Tank and stepping back to James's side. Tank scrambled to his feet, his face pale. The other bikers hesitated, looking to their leader for direction. But Tank had no more fight left in him. He wiped his hands on his jeans, muttering curses under his breath. "Let's go," he growled, avoiding James's gaze as he turned toward his bike. The bikers followed, their earlier bravado extinguished. The sound of their engines faded into the distance, leaving the diner bathed in an eerie silence. James watched them go, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp. Max stood beside him, his tail wagging slightly as if sensing the victory. The waitress stepped outside cautiously, her face a mix of relief and awe. "I've never seen anything like that," she said softly. "You and Max, you're incredible." James looked down at Max, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "He's the incredible one," he said. "I just follow his lead." The waitress shook her head. "No, it's both of you. The way you handle yourselves, it's like you've seen it all and then some." James didn't respond immediately. He looked out into the night, his thoughts far away. "We've seen enough," he said finally. "More than enough." The waitress nodded, sensing the weight behind his words. "Well, I'm glad you were here tonight. I don't know what would have happened if you weren't." James offered her a faint smile. "Me too." As he and Max walked back to their truck, the bond between them felt unshakable. They had faced another challenge together, and once again, they had come out stronger. For James and Max, the road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: whatever came their way, they would face it together, side by side, as they always had. The tension in the diner hung in the air like a storm cloud, but it wasn't a storm of fury, it was one of quiet justice. James stood tall, his posture unwavering, as Tank and the other bikers backed away, their once dominant postures now broken and uncertain. The leader of the group, Tank, his earlier bravado evaporated, stammered an apology, his voice unsteady and filled with regret. He avoided James's eyes, too proud to show the full extent of his embarrassment, but the shame was clear. I didn't know who you were," Tank muttered, his words coming out in a jumble. The air around him seemed to shrink as his usual swagger faltered. "I'm sorry, man." James didn't move a muscle. He didn't need to. The force of his presence was more than enough. There was no need for threats, No need for more words. Just the simple fact of standing there, resolute and unmoving, was all that was required to let Tank and his gang know that they had lost, and that they would not get away with disrespect. Max stood beside James, a silent but powerful reminder of their strength. His posture was calm, but every fiber of his being seemed to exude readiness. He didn't growl. He didn't show aggression. But there was something about the way Max stood alert, poised, and strong that made it clear, if James said the word, Max would act. The diner staff, who had been watching the exchange with wide eyes, were now standing at the edges of the room, uncertain of what would happen next. The patrons who had been too nervous to speak during the confrontation were now staring in awe at James and his dog. There was no shouting, no chaos, just the quiet power of two individuals who had earned their place in the world through struggle and service. The bikers, their pride now shattered, began to turn, one by one, toward the door. Each of them cast furtive glances at James, but none of them dared to make eye contact for too long. The older biker, the one who had initially tried to step in earlier, said nothing as he made his way to the door. His eyes were downcast, and his shoulders were hunched. He had nothing left to say. "Let's go," Tank finally muttered under his breath, his voice low and defeated. He glanced at the other bikers and gestured for them to follow. The once formidable gang that had thought they could intimidate anyone into submission now looked small, their arrogance gone, replaced by the quiet retreat of those who realized they had lost not just a fight, but their sense of dominance. As they filed out of the diner, the sound of their motorcycles roaring to life seemed less like the triumphant noise it had been when they first arrived, and more like the sound of a retreat. The engines revved loudly, but there was no pride in the noise. There was no victory in it. The bikers, who had once believed they were the kings of the road, were now reduced to a group of men who had been humbled by a quiet, unassuming veteran and his loyal companion. The door closed behind them, and just like that, the room fell silent. The waitress, who had been standing by the counter, still looked a little shaken, but there was a new light in her eyes, admiration, maybe even awe. She finally spoke, her voice quieter now but full of respect. "That was something else," she said, her eyes on James and Max. "I didn't think they'd just back off like that. You didn't even raise your voice." James didn't smile, but there was a glimmer of appreciation in his eyes. "Sometimes you don't need to yell to make a point," he said simply. "Sometimes, just standing your ground is enough." The patrons who had been watching the confrontation from their booths slowly started to relax. The fear that had gripped the room began to dissipate, replaced by a new sense of relief. No one said much, but the quiet respect was evident. James wasn't just a retired soldier, he was a man who commanded respect through his actions, not his words. Max, sensing that the tension had finally broken, let out a small, contented huff and lowered himself to the floor at James's feet. His duty had been done. His watch was over. The older man at the counter, who had watched the entire confrontation with a mix of curiosity and disbelief, tipped his hat toward James. "You're something else, Sergeant," he said with a nod. "Don't see many like you around anymore." James gave a small nod in return. "I'm just trying to get by," he replied, his voice low. "But sometimes, getting by means standing up for yourself." The waitress approached with a fresh cup of coffee, her hands a little steadier now. "Can I get you anything else?" she asked, her voice still laced with admiration but now with a touch of normalcy returning to it. James looked at her for a moment, considering. "Another coffee would be good," he said finally, his tone warm but not overly familiar. He wasn't the type to make small talk, but he appreciated the gesture. The waitress poured the coffee into his cup and set it down in front of him, her hands still slightly shaking. She didn't seem afraid anymore. In fact, she seemed more at ease now. There was something about James that made her feel safe, even though she knew nothing about his past. It was a quiet strength, the kind that didn't demand attention but commanded it when necessary. James took a sip of his coffee, the warm liquid sliding down his throat, grounding him in the present. He didn't know what the future held, but for tonight, the world felt right again. The bikers were gone, their threat neutralized, and the diner had returned to its quiet routine. Max, always by his side, was the picture of calm. He lay on the floor, his head resting on his paws, as if the events of the night had been just another part of the journey. To him, there was no fear. There was only the mission, the bond he shared with James, a bond forged in the fires of combat and strengthened in moments like this one. The door to the diner opened again, and another group of customers walked in. They glanced at James and Max as they made their way to a table. It was a subtle nod of recognition, a small moment of respect from strangers who had witnessed something extraordinary without fully understanding it. James didn't acknowledge them, but he didn't need to. His reputation, earned through action and not words, had already been made. As the night wore on, the diner returned to its usual rhythm. The clinking of silverware, the soft hum of conversation, and the quiet bustle of the late-night crowd filled the space. James finished his coffee and stood up, glancing once more at the door to the outside world. It was time to go. The waitress gave him a small smile as he stood. "Take care out there, Sergeant," she said quietly. James nodded and headed for the door, Max right behind him, ever loyal, ever steady. As he stepped out into the night, the cool air greeted him like an old friend. The world outside was still vast, still full of unknowns, but James and Max had faced worse, and they had done it together. No matter what lay ahead, James knew this, he would never back down from what was right. He had seen the darkness of the world, but he had also seen the light. And as long as he and Max stood together, there was no force, no biker gang, no enemy that could ever break their bond. Because in the end, true strength was not in the loudest voice or the biggest threat. It was in the quiet resolve to stand up for what was right, no matter the odds. And that, James knew, was a lesson that would echo long after the bikers had faded into the night. As James finished his meal and reached for his wallet, the diner's atmosphere seemed to shift. The earlier tension had melted away, but there was still a quiet respect lingering in the air, as if the whole room was holding its breath. The waitress, who had been hovering near the counter since the bikers left, approached him with a soft smile. "Thank you for your service," she said, her voice sincere and calm. "Both of you." James met her gaze, his expression warm but not overly emotional. He gave a small nod, then turned to Max, who was still resting at his feet. Reaching down, he gave Max a gentle pat on the head, his hand moving with practiced ease, the same way he might have patted a comrade's shoulder after a job well done. "Sometimes, strength isn't about how loud you are," James said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that seemed to settle in the hearts of those around him. "It's about knowing when to stand your ground and letting actions speak louder than words." The words weren't just a reflection of what had just happened in the diner, they were a philosophy James had lived by for years. Strength didn't come from shouting or seeking attention. It didn't come from flexing muscles or showing off power. True strength, James believed, came from the quiet confidence to know who you were and what you stood for and to act on it, without needing to prove anything. Max, who had been patiently lying on the floor, looked up at James as if he understood. His eyes, full of intelligence and loyalty, met his owner's gaze, as if to say, "We've done our part." As they turned to leave, the rest of the diner seemed to watch them. It wasn't obvious, not in an overt way, but there was a collective awareness. The bikers had come in like a storm, full of noise and chaos. They had tried to intimidate and disrupt. But in the end, it was James and Max, with their calm demeanor and quiet strength, who had made the real impact. The cashier, who had watched the entire ordeal from behind the counter, was still standing in the same spot, her hands lightly resting on the register. As James and Max made their way to the door, She glanced at them again, her eyes full of a kind of silent gratitude. "Take care out there," she called softly, almost as if she were speaking to an old friend. There was something in her tone that made it clear she wasn't just saying it out of politeness, it was genuine. She had witnessed something rare, something worth remembering. James gave a small wave, his expression still calm but with a trace of appreciation. "You too," he said, his voice low but steady. With that, the door opened, and the cool evening air rushed in. The world outside was waiting, full of its own challenges and uncertainties. But James knew one thing for sure, he wasn't afraid of what lay ahead. Life had a way of testing people, of pushing them to their limits. But James had faced enough battles both on the front lines and in life to know that the key to surviving wasn't about reacting to every challenge with anger or force. It was about knowing when to stand firm and when to walk away. As he stepped out into the night, Max by his side, James glanced around the parking lot. The motorcycles were gone. The bikers, who had tried to make a spectacle of themselves earlier, had slunk away, defeated without a single punch being thrown. The roar of their engines had faded into the distance, a reminder of how fragile arrogance really was. James didn't need to prove anything. He didn't need to boast about his past or force others to see his value. His service, his strength, and his sense of justice spoke for themselves. In a world where loud voices often got the attention, it was the quiet strength, the calm, unwavering resolve that had the most lasting impact. As James and Max walked toward his truck, the soft crunch of gravel underfoot was the only sound that filled the silence. It was a peaceful kind of silence, one that felt like a reward for having done what was right without ever raising a hand in anger. James didn't feel the need for applause or recognition. His actions had spoken loud enough. And for him, that was enough. Max, sensing his owner's mood, stayed close, his ears perked as they approached the truck. James opened the door and helped him up into the passenger seat before climbing in himself. He turned the key in the ignition, and the truck rumbled to life, the engine purring smoothly as they started down the road. The world beyond the diner was vast, and its challenges were many. But James knew that, no matter where he went, he would always carry the lessons he had learned with him. Life would never be easy, and there would always be people who tried to push him, to test his patience, or to make him feel small. But James had learned a long time ago that the most important battles weren't the ones fought with fists or words. They were the ones fought with conviction, with honor, and with the quiet strength to stand up when it mattered most. The road stretched ahead of him, long and winding, but James felt ready for whatever it might bring. He had Max by his side, a loyal companion who had been through it all with him. Together, they had faced danger and uncertainty, and they had always come out stronger on the other side. As they drove into the night, James couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed in his life. He had started as a young man, full of ambition and ready to take on the world. But the years had taught him something more valuable. True strength wasn't about seeking glory or recognition. It was about standing firm, knowing your worth, and protecting those who needed it most. And as he glanced over at Max, who was resting quietly in the passenger seat, James knew that no matter what came next, he was ready. Because the greatest power came not from what you could do to others, but from what you could do for them. And James, with Max at his side, would always choose the path of honor, no matter the cost. The road ahead was theirs to travel, and with every mile, James knew that strength was in the journey itself, silent, steady, and unshakable. And that was the kind of strength that no one could ever take away.